As a retired archaeologist, I can attest that American archaeology is still rooted in 19th century belief systems. They're not theories about the people of North and South America, but they're beliefs, akin to religious dogma. Anything that doesn't fit with this belief is treated as heresy.
Shouting to the world throughout the centuries, we have a technology to do this, and we're showing it off. And nobody since has a technology that can duplicate it.
Welcome to the Days of Noah podcast, where we talk all things biblical, supernatural, and strange. This week, my brother Luke and I are going to talk about elongated skulls, found all around the world, and ancient megaliths, technology that we cannot even duplicate today. Before we get into the elongated skulls episode of Blurry Creatures with Brien Foerster, I wanted to quick go over a quote from Doug Van Dorn in his book, Giant Sons of the Gods. I thought this was really good because we were talking about Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And I think you and I talked about this when we got together recently, but I just wanted to touch on it quick because he had a good quote, and then we can roll right into the elongated skull stuff. So he was basically saying that you have an inconsistent spiritualization that goes on if you consider the serpent seed as like metaphorical or some sort of spiritual meaning, but then the woman's seed, the coming Messiah, is like actual physical. So he's kind of calling that like a double standard. So a lot of people will call the first seed spiritual, like wicked people. Your spiritual father is of the devil. So like if you're familiar with Jesus' conversation in John 8 with the Jewish leaders, and he was saying, if God were your father, you would love me because I came from God. And he calls them out and says, you are of your father, the devil. And the word used there is ek in the Strong's 1537, and it just means out of, from, by, or away from. So it's not like a literal lineage or offspring. Like in Genesis 3:15, the seed word is the same word both times. It's Zerah, Strong's 2233, and that means like seed, semen, offspring, descendants, children. So a lot of people will spiritualize that first seed as, wicked people from or of the serpent, but they have to have justification to splice up the meanings. And so Doug says, I don't have a problem with saying that both are spiritual, or even that both are physical and spiritual, but he says there's an inconsistency if you call one spiritual and the other biological. So then, thinking about that the last couple of weeks, I thought, it's probably both, but one way I thought of it is if it's not a literal offspring of the serpent, then it could be of his lineage, as in angelic DNA. And of course that fits right in with Genesis 6 and the Nephilim and the seed of the angelic procreation. So that would be one type of seed that would be of the serpent, and then then you'd have human, of course, which is where you get, the line of Messiah through there. So I think that's one way to think of it. If it's not literally his offspring, then it could still be literally in the physical sense because he's of a different type, right? He's an angelic DNA. And I would like to hear Michael Heiser's thoughts on that, because there was one video that he suggested the serpent seed was metaphorical, but I haven't come across anything more from him on that, so kind of want to see what he thinks, where he gets that idea.
Yeah, I think that scripture, in my mind, or my opinion, in Genesis 3:15, I really think it's dealing with both, because you have character traits or the will that people have. So the choices that people make can take you, either you're doing the will of the Father, or you're doing the will of the flesh, or the will of the serpent. So there, you could almost put that in the category of spiritual. And then you have testimony, and we know there was literal seed that produced literal offspring throughout history. So I feel like that one verse is encapsulating both, just because there's so much evidence that both took place. So like you said, when Jesus is correcting the apostle Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," it wasn't literally Satan, an offspring of Satan, standing before him. No, this is his chosen servant, his chosen apostle. But his character, his will, the motivation of his words was wrong. So Jesus was getting to the root of it. And what does it say in Revelation? That if you got the Satan is the father of lies, and I think there some scripture that I think it was the Lord that is correcting somebody that was a liar. "You're as your father, the devil." Are they literally the father? Is the devil literally their father, like genetically? No. But if your will and your behavior is not in line with God, the flesh and the serpent seed, his motivation, those are aligned. So you really have to. There's a lot of examples that both are taking place. So I don't think that scripture can be described one way or another.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is probably a dual meaning, and we see that a lot. Like when God says things, He often has layers of meaning behind things. Like even the double meaning of "on this rock I will build my church," and reference to both Peter's name, but where he's actually standing there at the foot of the literal gates of hell and, Mount Hermon.
Well, as we're learning, and you gave some examples of the Strongs and the original language and their meanings. It's been said about love in the English word for affection, love, whereas the original agape, love, I think I'm saying it right, is Greek, and there's dual meanings in words. It seems like unfortunately English is not a good language.
It's not as precise. No, it's not as precise.
Convey meaning.
Greek and Hebrew, I have heard, are very good for being precise. So we're fortunate that is the the language that we have our Old Testament in, and New Testament. Old Testament in both with the Septuagint translation. But yeah, they're much more precise. Yeah, with just love, you've got, romantic eros, you've got agape, with God, and then you've got, I think, philos, which is friendship. And there might be a fourth one in there too, but there's at least three. So yeah, it's not as precise. Yeah, I think that's probably the way to take it. Is a dual meaning, and it's interesting too, especially in our day and age, how much we spiritualize things in the Bible, and we immediately dismiss a literal meaning to a lot of things in Scripture. We go right to a spiritual, and it might have both.
It does, and I know Dr. Michael Heiser doesn't want us, in his opinion, to look at Scripture entirely literal, because then you're missing context, you're missing other angles. So it's good to look at it from multiple facets, just like we're trying to dig into the meaning of words. And I was reminded of something, how Babylon, and I think it has a meaning dealing with confusion, the Tower of Babel. Well, there's a Mesopotamian meaning, because that was in that region, and I think the Mesopotamian meaning of Babylon was Gate of the Gods. So you really need to look at meanings. How do other people look at those words too? So you definitely got to go at things from different angles, and we know the enemy wants to confuse us. Our own flesh can confuse us. So the Lord brings clarity to things if we really study to show ourselves approved, and that is our hope. And I know that's kind of why we're doing this, is to kind of parse our understanding of things and to try to clarify it in our minds on this subject. So
yeah, and how it lines up with history, how it lines up with archaeology, testimonies of people. Yeah, I mean, I think if all we had was like a biblical exegesis of Genesis 6:4, okay, that'd be one thing. But then when you have all these other bits of evidence, it really makes a complete picture. So,
right.
Yeah, and I think Michael Heiser's right on when he's like, you got to put yourself in the mindset of these people. What was their culture like? What were the books that they would have been familiar with like? Yeah, because there's a lot of like, I think it's Ugaritic, Mesopotamian. Some of those words I kind of get interchanged, but yeah, just the template of the culture in the Second Temple period. There's a lot of that language, like when Peter uses the word Tartarus, like that's out of Greek mythology. When he says, angels chains in darkness, it's the only time in the Bible that the word Tartarus is used. It's like this abyss, this lower level of hell or something. But yeah, he's taken language right out of, pagan cultures.
Right.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, let's move on. So, Brien Foerster, quite an expert on the elongated skulls, been studying that for many years. And I guess he and L.A. Marzulli have done a lot of work together, working on these things. So that's pretty cool. I would like to get into some of L.A.'s DVD series and books on that, and kind of get his take.
If you go to his website, or just Google his name, I think it's .net. He's got a store there. I've purchased a few things, and just recently, I think it's going on right now, Christmas 2022, items that are not on sale. I'm throwing out an advertisement for him. 50% off. So, and he's got access. He's got a lot of his DVDs where you can buy them 50% off and stream it. You could either rent it or you can buy the streamed version. You own it. You just log in anytime you want, and it's the streamed version. So definitely worth. I actually got two of his at the half off price. So yeah, great resource. So if anybody wants to check it out.
I would like to have
Oh,
have that as part of my collection. I'm gathering up a lot of Kindle books, a lot of wish list items from different authors. You know, you gave me the Roots of the Federal Reserve from Laura Sanger. You know, I'm reading Doug Van Dorn's book. I'm close to finishing Michael Heiser's Unseen Realm, at least on Audible. I would like to get a text version to go through it in more detail, but yeah, there's a ton of good information. We don't have to really reinvent the wheel. There's so much good information on the topics we're looking into. So, Brien Foerster talks about he had 30 or 40 medical professionals look at these elongated skulls, and they really just didn't have any context for how to think of these things, because obviously they're not coming across them in their schooling or in their professions. But I wanted to go through some of the physical features and then talk about kind of the geography around the world. So one of the characteristics is up to 50% larger eye sockets. And then another is the sagittal suture missing. So the sagittal suture is the connective tissue between our skull plates. And I believe it's the one that runs front to back in our skull, from like the top of our skull backward. And these elongated skulls, one of the features that is completely different genetically, and something that you can't account for with the cradle headboarding that a lot of people say, and they do find elongated skulls that are headboarded, but the natural elongated skulls are completely missing that suture, and they only have like a front to back division between the plates. They don't have one running front to back, dividing the left and right. And then the brain cavities are 20%, and I believe up to 40% larger. I remember several years ago watching one of L.A. Marzulli's videos, and he had a naturally elongated skull, and they filled it with rice and compared the volume to a normal human skull. And that was, if I remember right, it was 40% more volume in the brain area. And then there's where the spinal column enters the skull, called the foramen magnum, and that is about an inch out of place compared to ours. So ours is like normal human skull. It comes in kind of centered, balanced. But these elongated skulls, obviously with more mass, more cranial mass, different center of gravity, it's about an inch different where the spinal column enters. And then, of course, the DNA results too. Some coming up as unknown, some being from groups that are not like Native American in these areas, and so they're trying to account for why those would be there.
And that was Brien Foerster, and as a research for anyone's listening to this, the Blurry Creature episode 7, correct?
Yep, that was 7.
So yeah, he is definitely kind of like we were saying. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on a lot of this. Go to the source, the ones that do the research. That's an excellent episode to really dig into that subject, and it is interesting. So you're right. The headboarding did take place, which a lot of people feel like the cultures were emulating what they saw was actually a real elongated skull, and almost idolizing them and wanting to be like them. So they were making their kids' heads to be that way, so they were manipulating. But like, as you stated, the ones that were found that was genetically different, it couldn't be a headboarding situation because of the way it lined up. I forget that part of that you mentioned, but
the spinal column.
It is very
yeah,
the spinal column, and there's that hole there. It is curious to see, and why Peru, I don't know, but Peru seems to be that area they found the most.
Yeah, the Paracas skulls of Peru, I guess, is the highest concentration in the world, and the second highest concentration. I was listening to an episode with Derek Olson. I believe it's episode 132 of Blurry Creatures. The second highest in the world comes from the Black Sea area of Crimea. So it's near the Middle East. So there's a strong likelihood of that migration, probably from the Middle East area and then ending up in Peru and Bolivia. And we'll get into some of that geography. But yeah, I mean, you combine all of these physical features, the eye sockets, the sagittal suture missing, the greater brain cavity, I believe Derek said up to 50% greater cranial mass, the roughly an inch different of the forma magnum, which is where the spinal column comes in. And then there's a few other things that aren't as talked about as much. There's some tiny bones towards the back of these elongated skulls, and they actually call them Inca bones. And our skulls don't have those. There's typically a larger, more massive jaw. I think that's about all of the main features. But again, yeah, you're not going to get that from cradle headboarding. You know, these are actually genetic anomalies. And they're finding these, sometimes they're finding, you know, over 100 of these in one burial area. So it's not like you could explain it away and say, oh, well, we have, you know, genetic mutations, diseases, and weird formations of people. Yeah, that happens. But you don't typically have a concentration of them in one area. And like you said, you don't have, you know, cultures presumably emulating them by trying to mess with their infant's skull to try to make them look like some other people group. So I think it'd be a really good follow-up episode for us to kind of round out this topic, to go to that Derek Olson episode, because there's some things that he mentions about sound and frequencies, and maybe their skulls having something to do with the sounds that they were able to create. And he mentioned something about that having to do with, like, they thought it a way to enhance their rituals or their worship. So there's a lot to do with frequencies and vibrations and sounds that has to do with some of these occultic things and some of these, you know, technology things, like, you know, being able to move these megaliths, these, you know, hundreds and hundreds of tons stone. I was just finding this morning about being able to levitate rocks with frequencies. You know, and there's many, many videos on that. So I think that'd be really interesting to talk about, and that would kind of segue into Dr. I'm going to mess up his name. Masuro Emoto, I think is his name. His experiments on the power of words. So I think there's some interesting segues into that. And then Brien also mentioned just how many doors continue to close when he tries to investigate and test DNA. Like one of the colleagues that he had, he said, "Did you get the results?" "Yep, we got the results." "Are you going to publish this?" "Nope, not going to publish it." Or he'll have some cooperation with people, and then they get to a certain point and they say, "Nope, you can't go any further." And that just seems to be a theme of of trying to either cover up because it's something they don't agree with, they don't want the information out. I think there's also a threat to people's jobs. You know, if you've got a job at a university or a hospital or a scientific organization, you know, are you really going to step outside the bounds of the traditional evolutionary narrative and talk about some of this stuff? And then there's a really good quote I found from a YouTube commenter on one of Brien Foerster's videos, and I wanted to read this. So shout out to this retired archaeologist. I forget his YouTube name, but I thought he said it really well. He said, "As a retired archaeologist, I can attest that American archaeology is still rooted in 19th century belief systems. They're not theories about the people of North and South America, but they're beliefs, akin to religious dogma. Anything that doesn't fit with this belief is treated as heresy." And so it's kind of that group think, you know, or wrong think that you're not allowed to talk about. You know, and that's obviously pervasive in our, you know, our universities. Young people going to get higher education end up coming out thinking all the same about history, about Christianity, about the Bible, about evolution. And you're rarely allowed as a student or a professor in most of these places to go outside of that that normal thinking. So no surprise that Brien Foerster, L.A. Marzulli, and others, you know, find these roadblocks when they try to look into these things further. So, you know, some people throw out, well, if this was really true, we'd hear about it. It would be major news. Well, there's so many factors, and I want to do a podcast on just that, on the factors of how do conspiracies, how do facts stay hidden. And it doesn't have to be some, you know, some person pulling all the strings, like some puppet master, you know, like a George Soros with huge ties of power and money. Although that does happen. A lot of times it's just the low-level guy, you know, working in a lab or at a university, and he's got a decent paycheck and a family, and he doesn't want to lose that.
Very true. Yeah, there's a lot of factors in that. Tenure, money, livelihood, yeah, who you're supporting, your colleagues, peer pressure, influence and stuff. All those things factor into things. And then you got, you know, it goes again with money, financing your projects, because if you're in archaeology or, you know, you're in doing these testings, you know, it's a lot of it is tied to universities, which are very profitable, and they could choose to use a different lab. They can use something else, and if it doesn't fit a certain narrative, it does seem to happen where they'll change it. Yeah, I think he used that example. He had all the green lights going forward with the DNA testing, and in his opinion, he thought the tester was hoping it was going to be the native culture in that region, but the results weren't what they were expecting. So because they weren't what they were expecting, they decided not to publish it. They decided not to continue to further explore those possibilities. And I think there's a lot of benefit to someone like a Graham Hancock. And it's interesting that Netflix came behind him with that series, because he's been labeled, you can pull him up on Wikipedia and stuff, as a pseudoscientist, but he's not a scientist. He's not a pseudo archaeologist, because he's not an archaeologist. He's just an investigative reporter that's asking a lot of good questions and done a lot of good research. And that's what people are wanting to do. I heard it said by Elon Musk in a tweet yesterday. He's like, it was a particular subject, and he was happy that the far left and the far right, or 80% or the 20% were mad. He's like, then if I've got 80% of the viewpoints willing to have a dialogue, that's what you want. You don't want the far left or the far right to dominate any conversation, whether it's this that we're talking about or politics or whatever. You want to have a platform where you can exchange information and debate ideas and see which ones are accurate. And science claims they got it all figured out, but obviously they don't. And if it's true science, they should be testing all ways of thinking, even if it totally changes their paradigm.
Right. That's the least scientific thing, is to say that science is settled. And there's a term that was coined some years ago, scientism, where it's a religion, it's a dogma, and so yeah, true discourse of ideas, that is not something that that Satan wants, that the enemy wants, that those opposed to biblical truth want, that those that have kind of a dog in the fight of evolution or a certain narrative of history, they don't want that idea, those ideas discussed, because truth will stand up to it. Truth will stand up to scrutiny.
Right. And that's what you were trying to do with having this conversation, especially if we had any of our friends join on, is we are welcoming the criticism, the questions, the analysis on these subjects, because it helps us dig into it, and it's either going to strengthen our position or, okay, well, maybe
point out some cracks,
something else. Yeah. Find the cracks.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's why, as I put it out to more and more people to hopefully join in on the discussion, that we welcome those disagreements and those hard questions. That's what makes a more rich discussion too.
It'd be nice to have a Discord or some place where we could allow people to chime in and ask questions or state certain opinions, and then we can discuss those. Kind of like you had that coworker, that gave you a list, and then you started researching it. Yes, he wasn't there to defend or rebuttal your answers, but maybe a message board of some type we could use where other people could chime in would be beneficial.
I think that's a great idea, especially because a lot of people aren't going to be able to make like a live call like right now, but they'll be able to post these things and then we can address it. I think that's a great forum. There's some things that we can do to connect both the podcast platform to listeners, for them to be able to connect with us that way, but also a Discord would be a good method too. So yeah, I think we should definitely look into that. So then, talking about kind of the relation to Nephilim, this race of people with these elongated skulls. So it seems like that is not exclusive to Nephilim per se, right? That giants didn't necessarily have these elongated skulls, but perhaps this was a subspecies or a different race in some way. Probably related to them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would venture to guess, because it's kind of like the whole Book of Enoch, Genesis 6, the original Nephilim. That would be the pure offspring. And then you had the Rephaim, I believe it's stated. And those are almost like, or what is stated in Numbers. These are the descendants of the Anakim, or the Nephilim. So you have these generations later. So when we're getting into the time frame that we're talking about in Peru, and we're thinking that the skulls that are found are not headboarded, these are actual genetic mutations, or the way the genetics is designed to create the body. It seems to me to be down the family tree, so it's definitely not a pure source. And I don't think it's, I don't know that it was a common thing all around the world either. We don't know that. I guess the jury's out on that one.
Right. I'd like to find some more resources on that and how they relate to Nephilim, giants, and that sort of thing. Because I think that's a kind of our assumption that they fall into that, but obviously, I don't think it's across the board that these characteristics were shared. The red hair seems to be one thing that is shared. That seems to be a commonly reported thing with giants and elongated skulls. And again, that would be something not native to like some of these South American areas that to have those characteristics. So switching kind of into the megaliths, some of the structures found around the world that show technology and expertise that we can't duplicate, we can't explain. So some of the areas, we've got Cusco, the capital of the Incas, in Peru, Bolivia, Middle East. There's Petra in Jordan, Egypt, Greece, Easter Islands, Sardinia. So there's all sorts of places that these megaliths are found. And then right in the U.S., you've got these mounds. Some of these things they're 2 stories or larger, and Native Americans have said that they did not build them. So we call them Indian burial mounds or Native American burial mounds, and they're saying nope, we didn't build these things. And you have to imagine too just the practicality of you're kind of a, I guess, hunter-gatherer type of society, right? Are you really going to spend that amount of effort to move that amount of dirt? It doesn't seem very practical, just in that sense. And then what we find with a lot of these megaliths is the building techniques are more advanced, but they are older than the less advanced structures. So you'll see those smaller stones on top of giant stones. So you see that in Peru. You see that in Lebanon with, what is it, like a 1,200 ton stone. And then there's some of these other structures where the stones are maybe like 100 tons each. And then you've got tiny little stones with mortar, built on top of it. Whereas these giant stones have no mortar. They fit together absolutely perfectly. You can't get a human hair between them. And some of these things, like in Lebanon, I think it's the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, but it's a mistranslation. Brien Foerster says. I forget what the exact translation is supposed to be. But that one is like 1,200 tons. So we're talking couple million pounds, and these are like of granite type stone. So some of the suggestions that skeptics have had, I forget the term now, I meant to look it up, but there's a technique with limestone where you can basically create like a concrete paste out of it, and then you can form it. So some of the skeptics are saying, some of these limestone structures, they could have done this to it in order to make make these things. They didn't necessarily have to cut a whole stone and move it. But that doesn't work for the granite and the quartz, where the Bronze Age tools that they had, it'd be like trying to chop down a tree with a plastic knife. I mean, you'd have a real hard time. And then, so the harder stones they wouldn't have been able to deal with. And then some of the shapes. I mean, you and I have looked at pictures of in Peru, I think is in particular, where you have these. This is not uniform construction. I mean, the most efficient way to build stone or brick is to make them all the same size so they fit together, right? You could make those. You could crank them out like an assembly line, the same size. And we have these megaliths where they're fitting together almost like a jigsaw puzzle, and they appear like they were even morphed like a marshmallow as they kind of sit together. That's not an efficient way to build construction, especially when you're talking about hundreds of tons some of these stones weigh.
Yeah, it's definitely not efficient, but if you have the technology, it definitely is unique. It looks pleasant to the eye,
Right.
'cause you got all these different angles and curves and stuff, so it's almost a style of it in and of itself. And it's purposeful,
No, the reason I brought up the efficiency is more to say, look, if this is not how we would do construction, especially with something so heavy and to have it fit so well. So I think it just shows another level of their expertise that they were willing to take it up to an artistic level, like you said.
Absolutely. And it's shouting to the world throughout the centuries, we have a technology to do this, and we're showing it off. And nobody since has a technology that can duplicate it.
I did look up what a modern crane can lift, because I remember either hearing or maybe it was my own opinion that, we can't lift some of these things. That's not entirely true. I did find the world's strongest crane can lift, oh gosh, I forget the number. It was many thousands of tons. So we do have the technology now, but just think of how much advancement in terms of mechanics and engineering and hydraulics had to come to the point in 2022 where we could even potentially lift one of these stones. So that's, night and day compared to what technology should have been in the accepted narrative of history, that we are more advanced now. People were less advanced then, but they were able to do it. And so it kind of, and one of the questions Nate had for Brien was asking, do you think it was, 20, 30 foot tall giants that may have moved these things? And that's entirely possible, but Brian's answer was, well, it's not just a matter of them being able to move these, it's the technology in how these things were cut. So that's the next thing I was going to bring up is some of these things have like laser precise cuts, perfectly level. We talked about the stones appearing to have almost been melted into place the way they sit together, no mortar between them. And then this is one of the most fascinating, I think, is the efficiency of cutting. So Brien says that based on what they see, the evidence of what they see and how these stones were cut, that it appears to be 300 times more efficient than our diamond cutting tools of today. And some of the cuts, he said, you can apparently, you can pick this up as a trained eye. You can discern that the cuts are searing through these hard stones like granite and quartz at 2 to 3 millimeters per revolution. Just try to put that in perspective. If you had a chainsaw going through a tree, yeah, you're probably moving it. Well, I don't know. I mean, how many revolutions does a chain go around a chainsaw? That'd be something to look up. But just imagine just one time around of a chain, and you've removed 2 to 3 millimeters of wood. I think that'd be pretty efficient. So we're talking about cutting these hard stones, and every time around, whatever blade or source they're using is removing that much stone.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, and it adds to the mystery of the lost technology, and it is an affront to the narrative that we evolved from these hunter-gatherer type people, and we're at the pinnacle today. We're not. There was some ancient technology that was far advanced than what we have right now. What happened?
Where'd the technology go? Yeah, where'd the technology go?
Who are these people that did it?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating time to be alive now, to be able to have, access to information and researchers and people who are asking good questions, like Graham Hancock, modern day Indiana Jones types like Tim Alberino and L.A. Marzulli, going out and testing these things and looking at these things and asking good questions. We can't stick our head in the sand. And it all ties back. I mean, I think as we're talking about a lot of these related topics, it all ties back to a source of technology and knowledge and understanding that the narrative of Genesis 6 is these watchers, these angelic beings brought into the world. And as I'm going through Annette Yoshiko Reed's book on how the book of Enoch was treated in antiquity by early Jews and Christians, just understanding that is an often forgotten source of the proliferation of evil and corruption that took place where the flood was necessary. It was a lot of the technologies that were taught when the angels took wives for themselves. They taught their wives these different crafts, and so you had an explosion of that corruption. So just kind of to wrap that up, as these megaliths and these strange skulls and things that we can't duplicate today, they all have that common connection into that. Some of the verses that stuck out to me that kind of put a framework for what we are trying to discuss, as I was sharing it with some people from church and so on. I thought of test all things, hold fast to what is good. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter, the glory of kings to search it out. Of course, Jesus said, as in the days of Noah, so it shall be when I come again. These type of verses that just give us that framework of what we're trying to do. Oh, and the fourth one, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So those are kind of the verses that come to me as we're trying to make sense of these things, and then also trying to show why it's important. It's about understanding, it's about discernment, it's about exposing darkness, and understanding the times we're in and what's to come. So, and it's just fascinating too, just the history of these things that, we're not, I mean, who's taught about megalithic structures, ancient technology, elongated skulls? This is not something you normally come across in school or in church. Thanks for listening to the Days of Noah. Join us next week as we continue our discussion on ancient technology, fallen angels, giants, the strange, the biblical, the supernatural, as we try to uncover the past, connect it to the present, and discern the future.